Delighted now to introduce our first keynote speaker today, Gurbir Grewal. Gurbir, you're on two giant screens in the Mayflower, to my right and to my left. And in a moment, Anita will be where I am, and you guys can take it from there. But let me quickly introduce Gurbir. He has been the director of the SEC's Division of Enforcement since July 2021. Prior to joining the SEC, he was Attorney General for the state of New Jersey, and also previously the Bergen County Prosecutor in New Jersey, and an AUSA for the District of New Jersey and the Eastern District of New York. Gurbir, we're really grateful to have you with us. Thank you so much for making this happen. Please join me in welcoming Gurbir Grewal. Our moderator today is Anita Bandy. Anita is a partner at Skadden in Washington as of March of last year, I guess. Prior to joining Skadden, she served for 17 years at the SEC in the Enforcement Division, where she held a number of leadership roles, including being an associate director. I think she's the perfect moderator for this, so join me in welcoming Anita Bandy.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Bruce. We always look forward to this exceptional conference that you organize every year. Really brings together the best of the bar and the great people we appear before. And one of the highlights is an opportunity to hear from the enforcement director. So Gurbir, thank you so much for joining us. We're so excited to hear your valuable perspective on a number of issues today. Thank you.
Thanks for having me, Anita. Thanks for the invitation, Bruce. And I really regret that I can't join you all in person this morning. And so thank you for accommodating me as well.
Great. So let's get right to it. We have limited time and folks are really anxious to hear your insight on a number of issues. So the first topic, Gurbir, that I wanted to explore is cooperation and self-reporting credit. The division has emphasized that companies that come forward with potential violations will face better outcomes. There are some recent examples where cases that were self-reported resulted in either no penalties or reduced penalties. But on the other side of the spectrum, there are cases that were self-reported that resulted in significant penalties. So there seems to be a lot of inconsistency and lack of clarity in terms of the considerations under CBORD in terms of what gets full credit versus partial credit versus barely any credit. So and there's certain areas of the program where no matter how good the cooperation is, there will always be a penalty. And I think we saw that in the off-channel area. So interested in your perspective, what are the factors that result in self-reporting and cooperation getting a reduced penalty versus no penalty? And if there's certain parts of the program where the division isn't interested in an amnesty program, why not come out and say it?
So, great question, and a timely one. You referenced off-channel communications. Let me start with the disclaimer that my views this morning or this afternoon are are my own and don't reflect the views of the commission, the commissioners, or the staff. They're my views in my official capacity as the director of the division. You know, I spoke yesterday at an event in the city here in New York at the Bar Association, and I started there talking about how public trust in our markets is faltering and how that's been borne out by study after study. And every day, as you know from your time here, the incredible staff work tirelessly to restore and enhance that trust. And this past fiscal year was no exception. The chair in his comments will touch on the successes of this fiscal year and the numbers. But we had another incredibly productive year. But one thing that is apparent that despite those numbers, those trends continue to go in the wrong direction when it comes to public trust in our markets. So one thing is clear, we can't do it alone. We need to create this culture of proactive compliance that I spoke about, that gatekeepers need to do their jobs, that compliance folks need to do their jobs, and we need folks to self-report. We need folks to self-police. And I think that's why you alluded to some of the orders from this past fiscal year. I think the commission, more so than ever before, has been clear in the types of behaviors that have resulted either in zero penalties or reduced penalties. And I think if you look through those orders, they provide a lot of clarity. I think the orders help you when you're having that difficult conversation with your clients as to whether we should go in and self-report or whether we should take a chance and really gamble that the SEC doesn't find out or a whistleblower doesn't come forward with information about this wrongdoing. And so the factors we consider when we're assessing that cooperation as you alluded to, are laid out in CBORD. They're well known to everybody in this room. It's about self-policing. It's about self-reporting. It's about remediation. It's about cooperation. But as you also know from your time here and from your time on the other side now, that cooperation varies, right? Some do better than others. So it's not an all or nothing type of calculus. The facts of the violation we're investigating in one case are different than in another case. The levels of cooperation in one case and the types of cooperation in this case may be different than what we're seeing here. And that's why you see this spread between penalties ranging from 0 to reduced, or maybe in some cases, no reduction despite cooperation. But that's something that CBORD itself, if I recall correctly, recognized, that there would still be cases where accountability required a penalty for deterrence. Because, after all, you can't commit all the violations you want, decide one day to self-report, and hope to walk away without any penalty or enforcement action. So that's what we look to. Like, we'll look at the cooperation on the one hand, we'll look at the violation on the other, the nature of the violation, all the statutory tiers, the guidance from the commission, judicial guidance, we'll look at comparables, and then you make the assessment in the recommendation what type of cooperation credit it merits. So again, in some cases it'll be reduced, in other cases it'll be nothing, and the recent commission orders, I think, do a good job there. And so I think what you're referring to as inconsistency is really just the facts of each case and the facts of each violation and the facts of how the entity really cooperated being different. In some cases we'll have a self-report, but it might be 10 years of violative conduct before that, or 3 years of violative conduct before that, and that needs to be addressed in the form of a penalty. As far as off-channel communications, I think you're right in part. The penalties certainly have been high. I think folks in the room you're in will agree that they've been on the higher end of penalties for these types of violations. But as I said recently, when we announced the latest round of those matters, there was one order that didn't look like the others. There was one order that stood out because there was a self-report and there was cooperation, and that was Perella Weinberg. And that was a $2.5 million penalty, and it was substantially less than the others. So I do think the commission is doing a better job here in laying out in these recent orders, if you look at them, the types of behaviors that are resulting in cooperation credit. And again, we have to understand that each case is different. It's not a all or nothing type of calculation, and cooperation varies and self-reports vary and self-policing varies. And so all that's taken into account.
Thank you, Gurbir. So sticking with the topic of settled actions and relief and remedies, I wanted to ask you about independent compliance consultants, ICCs, which, as you know, can have significant collateral consequences, especially in the regulated space. So if you look at DOJ, they've come out with pretty clear policy guidance on circumstances where a monitor will be imposed, including where companies demonstrate that it has tested, that the program's been tested, it's effective, and it's adequately resourced and fully implemented. And DOJ has outlined several factors where a monitor will not be necessary, but we haven't seen as clear statements from the division on what are the circumstances that warrant an ICC. And as you just mentioned, commission orders do a good job on penalty where there is credit in explaining all the underlying factors that led to reduced or no penalties, but we haven't seen that kind of clarity in the orders on imposition of an ICC. So could you share your insight in terms of how the division's looking at the basis for imposing an ICC, and where is the spectrum in terms of self-directed undertakings versus where an ICC will be imposed, or no undertakings?
Yeah, also another good question. I think it bears mentioning that the DOJ's use of monitors is a little bit different than the Commission's use of ICCs. Monitors typically follow a guilty plea or a DPA, and they're used to make sure that the firm is remaining in compliance and adhering to the requirements of the DPA or the settlement with the government, and those monitors are reporting to the government about that compliance. So it's a little bit different than an ICC, where we're including undertakings as part of an order that are tailored to address the violations to ensure future compliance, that we're placing limitations on activities. So we're making sure the company's functioning in a certain way or operating in a certain way. And that ICC is working with that entity to affect that compliance. They're not reporting back necessarily to us like a monitor would be. And so, I think the orders, again, provided a lot of detail about the violative conduct. And so where we see that violations are pervasive, where we see that the duration of the misconduct is long running, where we see management involvement, where we see, that the existing programs weren't adequate, where we see that, the cooperation with the staff wasn't where it should have been, where we see, a lack of self-report or a self-report on the other side of the equation. Those are all the types of factors that we look at. And the off-channel communication cases are a good example where many of those factors weighed in the favor of ICCs, which were required in all 40 of those resolutions. Because in each of those cases, the firms at issue had the policies and procedures, right? All of them had the right policies and procedures. What they didn't have was the implementation and execution. What we saw time and again in those cases, in every single one of those 40 orders, what we saw was that you had the people who were responsible for making sure that there was adherence to those policies and procedures engaging in the same type of violative conduct. So there wasn't the implementation, there wasn't the right tone at the top. And so those were the types of factors, as I just tried to outline, that supported the ICCs in those types of cases. And those are the types of factors that the Commission looks at and I think are supported by the facts outlined in the orders where there is an ICC. On the flip side, if a company has done a good job and gotten to the remediation and gotten to the compliance and gotten to a place where where an ICC would be redundant or not necessary, you don't necessarily see that included in those orders. So those are generally the types of factors, but obviously, as you know, each case rises and falls on its own facts.
That's really insightful, Gurbir. Thank you. I want to move to the topic of subpoena enforcement. It seems that...
Did we do something recently?
So there's a recent matter that was pursued, but overall, across the program, we're seeing more activity in subpoena enforcement types of actions. And so, is this a signal to the industry that the division plans to seek this tool more broadly? What guidance can you share in terms of where the scale may tip more closely in terms of seeking this type of enforcement authority? Not necessarily like the easy case where somebody just doesn't, appear for testimony or there is just a blatant disregard for a document subpoena. Are there outside of these scenarios, are there other areas where the division is looking more closely in terms of using this particular enforcement tool?
I think the takeaway should be that we will use the tool whenever necessary, where we see dilatory conduct, where we see noncompliance. And even then, Anita, as you know, we rarely engage in a subpoena enforcement action. We don't have to generally because the staff does an incredible job working with counsel, working with the entities at issue, trying to be accommodating, tailoring our requests, accommodating clients about locations for testimony or timing of testimony. So we tried to work all this out. It's in our interest, in our shared interest, to move these matters along to make sure we could be reasonable with each other and get to the right place as far as whose testimony we're taking, where we're taking it, what documents we need, what documents we actually need, paring down our requests. So it is still the rare instance. I don't recall off the top of my head, but when I looked at this last fiscal year, maybe there were a dozen subpoena enforcement actions. It remains exceedingly rare, but when somebody is playing games or engaged in dilatory tactics as laid out in recent subpoena enforcement actions and the facts of those particular cases, you will see a history of the staff trying to accommodate and work with the counsel on the other side, and you will see a history of noncompliance and gamesmanship. And if that happens, we're going to go to a court, and we're going to get an order to show cause, and we're going to try to compel testimony and get the evidence that we need to move our investigations along with that sense of urgency that I've talked about in other contexts, because we need to get accountability. We need to have accountability, and we need to get that message out to the public that we are holding bad actors accountable, that they don't read about something today and it's like 3 years because people are engaged in dilatory tactics or for other reasons that we don't get to the accountability part of the enforcement action.
So Gurbir, I want to move to a process question, and I know you get asked a lot about the topic of the Wells process, but there's a particular issue that would be really helpful to hear your insight on. We've heard the front office's rationale for not taking Wells meetings, including, deference to the staff or the lack of a novel issue being present, are just some examples. But what about the notion of due process? Often matters get held up at the post-investigative phase because parties, particularly individuals whose livelihood or reputations hang in the balance of an potential enforcement action, they want to feel like they've been heard at the highest levels of the division. And these meetings often can lead to getting to the end point more quickly, because even if the party doesn't feel that they agree with the outcome, they feel like they've obtained fairness and due process at the highest levels. So is this getting considered, and what are your views on this particular issue, regardless of substance or the merits of the case?
Sure. I think to a certain extent, we certainly made clear early on, I made clear and Sanjay made clear in speeches that he had made, that we wanted to try to make this a more efficient process, because when we can streamline all of our processes, it's better for everyone involved, right? The longer an investigation goes on and hangs over somebody's head, an individual or an entity, that's a tough place to be. And so it's in everyone's interest, including if we're not going to make a recommendation for that person or entity under investigation, for that investigation to be resolved more quickly. So time and again, what we were seeing was some gamesmanship in this process that, before the Wells, don't Wells us yet, let us submit the white paper, and let's go through this white paper process. And then, okay, let's reiterate the same arguments in a Wells meeting and a Wells submission. And so that just lengthened the time of our cases. That's not to say we don't want to hear those arguments. They are incredibly important. They're an important part of the process. They aid our deliberations. But we all also have to agree that not every case requires a meeting at the deputy or the director level. That process may happen at the associate level or the RD level. And despite us exercising that discretion here, Anita, I think you should take comfort, and everyone involved in this process and your client should take comfort, that we still take a lot of Wells meetings. And even if we don't, we reviewed the submissions and there have been plenty of matters where we've not taken a meeting, we've reviewed the submission, where we've had a conversation with the staff and the team and thought it best not to move forward on a recommendation with an individual or an entity. That has happened, and it does happen. So beyond that, whether or not there's a Wells meeting with the director, by the time the recommendation gets to the commission, there's been an incredible amount of interaction. You've had significant conversations with the staff. You've had significant division review and consultation. We've reviewed your Wells submissions. We've prepared those recommendations to the commission and provided the commissioners with your Wells submissions. And there's discussion we have with the commissioners and their consideration of those arguments. So there is a lot of process, but again, I still believe that not every case merits a meeting at the director or the deputy level, unless there's a novel issue, a fact or law, or there are other considerations that cause that that require that meeting. But again, there's probably a week that doesn't go by where we don't have Wells meetings, so it's probably rare where we do say no. But I think the process is working. I think people are getting the process that's due to them, and I think the submissions we're getting from each of you and the meetings we're having are aiding us in our decision making.
Fair enough. Sticking to the topic of the Wells, we all read the high-profile Wells notice that was issued to a CISO in a cybersecurity matter that has caused quite a stir, given that these types of officials don't occupy the traditional role in connection with financial reporting, disclosures, accounting, the types of individuals that typically get in the crosshairs of enforcement investigations. So what are the types of factors, Gurbir, that will cause the SEC to look more closely at the CISO or the role of somebody that touches on more information security types of responsibilities?
Sure. Obviously I can't speak about any particular case, but let me just talk more generally then about how we're thinking about cybersecurity and the role of individuals, including CISOs. It's not different from everything else that we do, Anita. We're going to look at the facts and circumstances of each case. And so when it comes to the CISO, it's almost similar to CCOs, to Chief Compliance Officers. We don't stop necessarily with the person's title. We look at what the person knew, what they were aware of, what they did in this particular case or didn't do, what meetings they were in. Were they in the meetings where those disclosures were being prepared? So to your point, if somebody is not traditionally involved in that process, but given a set of particular facts, we're going to see how that measures up to the standards that are laid out in our statutes and our rules and our regs. So with respect to both CISOs and CCOs, we would look at whether the person was aware of red flags. And if they were, how did they respond to them? Or how did they fail to respond to them? And how did those actions and their awareness implicate internal controls and disclosures? So I think it's a very fact-specific inquiry. I think the takeaway should be, much like we talk about when it comes to CCOs, there was a compliance conference yesterday that I was at. I think the same holds true for CISOs. What I said there, that this can't be just sort of like a check the box exercise for you in this role. You really need to think about the risks that your entity is dealing with. You really need to think about the needs of your entities. You really need to tailor your policies and procedures accordingly, and you really need to take the steps to maintain and enforce those policies and procedures. And so that's how I think about it. And so again, depending on the facts of a case, if the CISO was involved in the disclosure process and had a certain level of awareness about certain facts that led him to know that those disclosures were inaccurate, then I think it's fair game, regardless of the title.
So shifting to now litigations, we're all awaiting the Supreme Court's consideration of the Jarchese matter. It didn't go unnoticed, though, while sort of we're waiting on this, that in late September the Commission filed charges in district court against an audit firm for violating independence rules. In light of this, wanted to get your thoughts on, what is the message that the division wants to send in terms of pursuing audit firms or potentially individuals who engaged in an audit? Can we expect to see more district court actions in this space, even if it means that the Commission may have to forego, unique remedies and relief, like a 102E suspension against an auditor or CPA, which isn't available in a district court action? So what are your thoughts on that?
A number of takeaways, really. I think the first one is that in the particular case you're referencing, auditor independence is important to us, right? It's a bedrock principle that underpins the credibility of financial reporting. So that's thing one. We take it seriously, and I know that there are so many people who work in this profession, who do the right things every day, who put a tremendous amount of effort in to make sure they're getting independence right, which is why it's so important that we hold those auditors responsible when there are wholesale failures in this space. So that's thing one. Thing two is that we're not going to just stop holding auditors and other gatekeepers responsible when they fall short of their professional obligations, just because there's some uncertainty in the courts, or just because we're waiting a ruling from the Supreme Court. We need to hold folks accountable now. And so filing in federal court is an option that's available to us, and we're committed to using every possible tool that we can to hold bad actors, in this case gatekeepers, accountable. And I think the last takeaway would be that anytime we're looking at an auditor's conduct, when it comes to a particular engagement, we're also focused on the overall quality control environment at that firm and the effect that environment has on the overall audit practice. So I know that may prompt some risk alerts. I know that may prompt some folks to write something, but that's not to say that we're going to start adding quality control violations to every matter that we're bringing. what it's saying is that there's going to be situations where there's a strong system of quality controls, and that may counsel and limit the scope of an enforcement action, counsel against one rather. But there may be a system where there's poor quality controls, and so that may expand our inquiry, but it'll be a point of inquiry for us when we look at the quality control environment at a firm.
Great. So I'd be remiss, I have two more questions and I want to end on a lighter topic. So maybe like lightning round question on financial reporting, an area that you and I work closely in. It's close to my heart. So look, we're seeing a lot of focus on qualitative materiality in this space, whether it's non-GAAP reporting, earnings management, even where the accounting's right, or the accounting didn't rise to the level of traditional notions of materiality from a quantitative perspective. Can we expect to see this trend moving into this current fiscal year?
Listen, financial fraud issues are an evergreen priority for us. I think, again, and I'll try to be quick, I think the bar does a good job at parsing every filing that we make and highlighting and focusing on when we're looking at non-GAAP metrics or whether something is material for qualitative reasons or quantitative reasons. I think the takeaway here should be all those considerations are valid, but sometimes we lose the forest from the trees, that what we're really talking about is communications with investors. And whatever those communications that management is making are to investors, they need to be correct and complete. So that could be non-GAAP metrics, it could be KPIs, it could be the MD&A, it could be financial statements. If they're not correct and complete, you shouldn't have to really spend time distinguishing between whether something's quantitatively material or qualitatively material. Either is sufficient to make an item material. So it'll be a continuing area of focus for us.
Great. In the final 3 minutes, another area that I know we've worked together in is in the area of DEI. Want to end on a lighter but very important note. You and I come from fairly humble immigrant backgrounds and have the privilege of spending most of our careers in public service as our minority representatives of wherever we worked. The SEC and the division, I think, has come a very long way since we started in government, and I think that, and you're still in government. And I think, there seems to be a more comfort with bringing your individual identity and your authenticity to work. And I think that's a quality, Gurbir, that people really admire very much about you. So as folks are sitting in this audience, people that might be considering a career at the SEC, as the division continues on its hiring frenzy, what can you share with folks in the audience who may be considering a career that speaks to how the division is building a more connected culture? I think you're a great ambassador to speak on that issue.
Another great question, Anita. Listen, I remember when I walked into the first law firm I joined in DC in 1999, and I walked through that door and there was nobody there who looked like me. There was no support network, there was no mentoring, there was no emphasis on DEI issues. I was made to feel at times unwelcome, and I didn't really have any way to deal with that until I found like a positive mentor. He didn't happen to share my background or experiences, but somebody who I could talk to and who supported me. That's a far cry from walking in the door at the SEC. This is a place that emphasizes collegiality. It emphasizes diversity. It emphasizes supporting each other, whether it's through our affinity groups or the proactive work that the associates in the home office do to go out there and do stakeholder mapping and making sure we're recruiting everywhere we should be recruiting and everywhere we could be recruiting, and bringing in a diverse workforce, both in background and experience. And you see that, you feel it at the SEC, and it's an environment that really benefits from that diversity. I think about our office in Miami that has the Fraud Against Minority Groups initiative. They are focusing on infinity frauds, and they're leveraging the diversity in the office, whether it's Creole speakers or Spanish speakers, people who could go into communities and talk to vulnerable investors and say, hey, we're the SEC, we're here to help you. How powerful is that when folks are coming from those very communities to provide support to the same communities? How powerful is it to the kid or the family who's sitting in those communities to see the person, a staff attorney or the regional director or people at different levels, whether it's somebody from their background or a different background, and say, hey, that person looks like me. Maybe I could do that one day too. And I think that's such an important part of these efforts that gets lost on a lot of people, that it's important for the young person who didn't think that these opportunities were available to them to see that they are available to them. That's what's sort of driven me through my public service journey, and it's going to continue to drive me on this journey, that maybe there's somebody else who thinks I could do this too. And that's a big part of this. It helps us work better, and it helps us open the doors for others behind us. And the SEC is really, of the places I've worked, it's really committed, invested in making sure that happens.
Well, I can't think of a better note to end on. Thank you so much, Gurbir. Thank you.